Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that gives you competitive advantage, an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world, looking for patterns and early warning signs, and asking how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's May 4th, 2026. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
Morning, Eric. I'm recovering. If I reflect on the last year, it's been sporty. One of the most interesting things has been that while I was going through treatment and we were doing this, I was fulfilling my board responsibilities, but remotely, right? So this year, starting April, was really my first big board month. We're trying to get back in the scheme of things, and I find I'm out of shape. I'm a little tired, but looking forward to recovering this week. So you're going to have to carry our banner this morning. What you thinking about?
In honor of May the 4th be with you and intergalactically recognized Star Wars Day, I was going to ask you, I don't really like asking favorite movie. We could go favorite movie if you want, but I was going to ask favorite Star Wars character. Who resonates with you and why?
So I'm going to go with the movie things first, and that is, it's got to be the original.
Episode 4 for you? Yeah.
Yeah.
First one?
I remember it like it was yesterday. Saw it. I don't know if it was the first time I saw it or whether it must have been, again, my sophomore year at Duke with Jim. And I don't know. There was just something idyllic about watching a movie in a big theater. It was just something I'll always remember, is sitting in a big auditorium at Duke watching a movie. Favorite character, though, I don't know, probably Han Solo, just because he was a bad guy. I mean, he was, a good guy, bad guy. My favorite characters in books and movies are like fundamentally good guys who are imperfect. And when I say guys, it happened to be a man in this one, but it could be a female character as well. So I like people who are fundamentally good, but are flawed, recognize their flaws, and have a good sense of humor on them. I'm going to go with Han Solo.
All right. Nice. Yeah, I think Han Solo's one of my favorites too. Probably my default. Same reasons. Him and Chewie, quite the team.
Yeah.
I also, in preparation for asking you this question, I think I'd be drawn more at this phase of my life to Qui-Gon Jinn, the old Jedi, but can't really revisit that because I want to watch episode 1 as little as possible. So maybe when it's time to watch with the kids, I'll re-interview Qui-Gon. And they're continuing to make more. A new Mandalorian movie coming out. So anyway, to everybody, may the 4th be with you.
I love it, Eric.
Yeah, what are we talking about today?
Okay, so I just came back from the Sedona conference at the McCain Institute in Arizona, where it's a forum that was really imagined by John McCain and the McCain family to bring thought leaders together to talk about big, important stuff. And I thought maybe we'd talk about the conversations that were held over those 2 days, because it was really kind of interesting to me, and that we talked a lot of the topics that you and I talk about on Understandable Insights. It was super bipartisan. Actually, in comparison to previous years before, the organizers really went out of their way to make sure that not only was it a stellar lineup of folks there, but that it was bipartisan. Almost every panel, whether it was talking about Ukraine or China or technology or budget, had representatives on both sides of the aisle. But the other interesting thing I thought was there wasn't much disagreement over the problems we're facing, which on the one hand, it's like, ugh, another day of problem identifying. But I will say the fact that there is growing agreement on the problems does give me hope that we can actually hone in on some of the solutions. So I thought we might talk about Sedona and just walk through those conversations kind of in terms of what I took away in the broader context of what we've been talking about over the past year in terms of the great rewiring and what conflict looks like and what governance looks like and are our systems holding up. Thought that might be fun for us.
Let's jump into it. So, the McCain Institute, as you mentioned, is a nonpartisan organization inspired by late Senator John McCain and his family. It's part of the Arizona State University system based in Washington, D.C. And then the Sedona Forum is their Super Bowl, held each spring in Sedona, Arizona, and provides unique opportunity for the U.S. and world leaders to have informal, face to face discussions about real solutions to the problems facing the world today. The theme this year was Challenges to American Dominance. So, Stu, at the conference, you had Ukraine, China, and Iran. Three different panels, but similar themes.
If I take them together, and I'll talk about each separately, but if I take them together, I think what I came away with is this notion of we're kind of entering a new phase of conflict, which isn't so much about resolution, it's about managing it. And for all President Trump's, how many wars has he ended? The truth is, if you take these three regions, Ukraine, China, and Iran, there is a conflict going on with each, albeit different ones. But we're not so much as resolving them as we're managing them. I mean, Ukraine has fallen off the front page, but it's raging on in some really interesting ways. Number one is, in a way, Ukraine defined modern warfare, modern kinetic warfare. Really drony, smaller, cheaper systems, and that's continuing. I think what's interesting is Ukraine is striking deeper and deeper into Russia, and so that's having economic impact. And so even though you still see conflict going on in the East, where kind of the grind out war of Russia incursion into Ukraine, you kind of have both things going at the same time, where Ukraine is not stopping in terms of its advance and having real economic impact on Russia. So I think that's super interesting in terms of it's fallen off our headlines, but it keeps on going on. And it is now the definition of modern warfare. I'll tell you what, our regional actors in Europe are not stepping away from it. They're not, as much as we might think that we're the big actors. So look at this, rages on without the U.S. making big plays one or another. And even though you hear pleas about the U.S. getting involved, those are almost more coming domestically than you're seeing internationally. So interesting how that's just turned into an ongoing managed conflict. Do you see it differently at all?
No, that's interesting, especially with the demands being more so domestically than internationally anymore. I was going to bring this up in the next segment of alliances, but just over the weekend, talking about President Trump announcing the 5,000 troops to leave Germany. That's an interesting development because of the roughly 36,000 U.S. troops that were in Germany at the end of last year. 5,000 is roughly 14% of that.
I'm kind of unsettled or unresolved on the issue of the U.S. pulling back from our basing and participation overseas. And I think my hesitance to say, yay, bring our troops back home, or yay, America first, let's spend our resources where they need to be. I do want to push back on the president's narrative that our participation internationally is all about helping them and protecting them. Let's not forget that it has served the United States really well to have essentially buffer geography around us. So this idea of pulling troops back, I'm kind of mixed about it, where I think it's a very myopic view of why we participate globally. And think about the Iran war without a presence in Germany for our troops. How do we project power? How do we bring injured home? What do they do if they don't go through Ramstein? What if more
Yeah.
people who had been our allies decide that they're not going to let us overfly or land or base? So it feels myopic to me, even though the way the discussion is framed as we need to take care of ourselves seems to have some merit. I think it's a myopic view.
Yeah, and you mentioned of Rammstein, like just from a tactical level there, that
Right.
was always our goal, was to get through the golden hour, stabilize the patient, and then expect them to recover in Rammstein instead of flying all the way back to the US or to another place to get that really higher level of care. When you start pulling back some of that, you reduce some of your capability to project power forward.
I talk a lot about it going to be a disproportionately digital world rather than a physical world, and power projection is much cheaper in a digital world. You just send those trons
Right.
across airwaves. But things do happen physically, and in order for those things to happen, you have to be present, and that includes not only if you decide you're gonna go into a hot conflict, or if you just wanna be an intelligence collector. There's a big difference between what you can get when you have physical presence and not, and boy, withdrawing ourselves physically, globally, feels like a big move with much bigger consequences than just showing those guys that we're not beholden to them, and you didn't come to our aid, so we're not gonna protect you. The China panel was interesting. One of the big conversations there is, especially with a presidential Trump visit coming up, what, in 2 weeks, supposedly, if it happens?
Yep. Keep sliding right. But I think it's around May 14th or so.
Yeah, I think the big question was, do we think the US and President Trump can have leverage there? Is there room to find some common ground to make real headway economically? I have two competing lines of thought on China, and it played out in the panel there. Is number one is they are a sovereign nation with their own goal, and their goal is distinct from Russia, that is to undermine democracy, particularly that which practiced in the West. China is, we think we can win the global economic competition. We think our system can replace the system that exists right now. And that's a big national goal. So to think that we're going to change their trajectory on how they see the world and how they want to participate in it and basically rewiring it in an advantageous way to China, I think is something we probably can't do. But we are super economically intertwined with them. I mean, you
Yeah.
see this all the time with the tension with companies that do we prohibit them, our companies, from doing things with China because we don't want to sell them our most modern devices and technologies? Or if we prohibit selling into that region, have we undermined our companies' abilities to be global leaders and competitors in technology? So our economic interdependence, I think, to me, has always given us an opportunity to have constructive partnership economically, as long as we don't confuse that we do not have the same goals in terms of freedom of commerce, freedom of navigation, and those things. That was playing out is, do we have WASTA in order
Hmm.
to come up with agreement, or is the gap just too great to be able to do it? So
Yeah, the freedom of data is one of the bigger concerns with them too. And we've talked about before selling H200s from NVIDIA to
yep.
them, right? The idea was we'll sell those and then we'll make money and then we'll use that money to further fund R&D and stay ahead while also incentivizing the world to be on the US tech stack.
Yeah, we'll get to this in a later conversation, but the issue of supply chain really came up. And that is, how dependent are we, and can we afford to be that dependent? So, kind of started in the previous administration with the CHIPS Act, but then a lot of moved now in terms of when you talk about bringing manufacturing back, look at what we've done in terms of pharmaceuticals and offshoring precursors. And so with China, a lot of talk about supply chain and supply chain security and how do we maintain that. So it was interesting that the China conflict was far less about their growing military capabilities and very little on the Taiwan issue,
Interesting.
much more about the economic interdependence and supply chain concerns. Also, the stealing of intellectual property, which really can't be abided. In the talk of bipartisanship, China is an area where we ought to be able to make real headway because there's just such bipartisan similarity in the view about the risks. Now,
Right.
difference in how decoupled you get. I think everyone who listens to us knows that I'm not a huge fan of decoupling. I think it is potentially more harmful to our standing in the world to separate ourselves. But still, I think the issue of how do we maintain enough independence to be able to pursue any of our aims is really what the discussion is about, and lots of bipartisanship. So this one feels to me like an area where we'll really get going. So that was China during
Nice.
these.
And what about your panel on Iran, where you're joined by
And
General Frank McKenzie,
yep,
right?
yep,
Former commander CENTCOM,
yep.
and then Reed Smith, Vice President of Foreign Policy at Stand Together, and then John Decker, White House correspondent and national editor.
Yeah. So I loved our panel, she says arrogantly. I thought it was really interesting. One of the John Decker's questions was, are we at war? And I made a couple points, and that is, we are most certainly still at war with them. It's just the domain has changed, right? That it's not a hot shooting war. It's now one that is so much more difficult to resolve, and that it's an economic war. It's a political war. It is a war of diplomacy and allies. And so the resolution to this conflict is much more profound. From a military side, we're all in agreement that we have done incredible damage to them. My point was, and they are a malign regime. We've talked about it in this forum. I don't know that if I were the decision maker, I would have chosen to go to war with Iran at this time. But there is no doubt that Iran is a problematic regime that did threaten both regionally and strategically with its aspiration for nuclear weapons. And so it was not a new idea that we should do something about them. I don't know that it would have been my choice, and I wish we had been a little more thoughtful about building a coalition, but I think it was a legitimate decision to do something. The problem I see now is, and I think everyone on the panel agreed with this, I think we will be lucky to walk out of there with an agreement that is better or even as good as JCPOA that President Trump in his first administration took us out of because he believed that we were giving them too much money that was allowing their proxy wars, which was certainly true, but it had constrained their nuclear ambitions by all accounts. So interesting discussion. You can imagine that General McKenzie, great guy, was really confident in the damage we had done to them militarily, but he also agreed that a blockade is an act of war. So we're still
Yeah.
going on. Reed was our third participant, was interesting. I think he was really on the side of what have we done? What was the legitimacy? Did we involve our partners? All the same things that we've talked about before. To me, I just hammer home the point that we've made, and that Iran is a patient adversary. I hear the president and Secretary Hegseth when he says, yes, they still have nuclear ambitions. I just don't know how you think it is rational that we are somehow going to destroy their ambitions, especially when we've done what we've done to them, where I think one of the takeaways would have to be, if I don't acquire nuclear weapons, won't this happen to me again? And won't I be at the whim? I think that it's going to be hard to get out of it now. And again, to my theme of Ukraine being managed and China being a managed conflict, this almost has the appearance of now being a managed conflict rather than something that you can resolve in one easy step. We did talk a bit about the Lego videos, and my point is they have certainly learned lessons of the past at least 15 years of the power of information dominance and information influence. And I don't think that changes their situation on the ground one whit, but they have certainly been aggressive about trying to shape international opinion, including opinion inside the United States. So
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, though, if the president could get an agreement, maybe with less financial contribution and more constraint on conventional weapons to JCPOA, the truth is that Iran would be much further away from being able to manifest its ambitions because of the damage that's been done to them, both militarily and infrastructure-wise. Mr. President, if you're listening, don't not take an agreement just because you don't want to be seen as weak and agreeing to something you got rid of before because the circumstance is different than it was back then. Do you have a different piece of advice for him?
I think that sounds great.
Yeah.
because it's the environment we're in now, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It is different. One of my favorite lines from the movie Draft Day, that's a deep pull. And that is, we live in a different world than we did 30 seconds ago.
Yep, good point. Also, it looked like Japan had a whole block and was well represented at the forum too. You had widow of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who was assassinated in 2022, as well as members of both Japan's Senate and House of Representatives present. So, Sue, what was your take on such a well represented delegation from Japan?
Now, one is just like Senator McCain, the Sedona Forum really has a remarkable ability to bring people together. I think 2 years ago, we had Machado from Venezuela from an undisclosed location
Uh-huh.
talking to us. So I don't mind this kind of convening just because it brings people with their own perspectives, and to have Mrs. Abe there was fabulous. So w I think from our lens, I don't know if this is what Sedona was thinking, but I think from our lens, Japan is just a really great example of all the shifts that you and I have been talking about in kind of the rewiring. And I don't want to make the US's actions be causal of everything, because these are independent nations, sovereign nations who can make their own decisions about what they're doing to a world that is changing in its nature as well. But let's just talk about Japan for a second. Number one is, I don't think the average listener is really paying attention to this, but Japan is actively shedding its post-World War II pacifism. And that is, there's a major push for them to revise Article 9 of their constitution that used to severely limit military use. Their defense spending is already at 2% of their budget and rising, and new policies are allowing them to export lethal weapons. And what's interesting is this now makes Japan a net security provider, not just a U.S. dependent. When you think about what that does regionally, is now Japan is someone with whom people can have independent relationships, not just as part of a hub and spoke U.S. coalition. Just as an aside, I think one of the other things is while Japan is doing this and making this decision from a government perspective, their domestic legitimacy is becoming a limiting factor. There are more protests, larger protests than we have seen in a long time. And so you see in Japan kind of some of the tension that you see here of, where are we spending our money? What are we doing? Who are we become? But I will say they are certainly moving from being a constrained military actor to one that is a normal military power. And it's not doing this overnight. It's doing it slowly, but it is certainly reinterpreting its own constraints, doing its own rewiring. Maybe that's in response to the hegemony of China in the region and China's aggression militarily, China's aggression in the South China Sea, maybe North Korea's nuclear ambitions and and its popping off of ballistic missiles into the Sea of Japan periodically. But Japan itself as a military power is changing. And then from its perspective with this shift, you see that it is expanding behind its partnership with the U.S. regionally. It's deepened its ties with Australia in energy and defense and minerals. They have a new defense pact with Indonesia, and they've got expanded cooperation with the UK, Canada, and the Philippines. I'm not saying that they're not still an incredibly strong U.S. partner, but it doesn't feel as U.S. centric in its direction as it does in kind of a networked alliance architecture. And so the Indo-Pac is, to use a network term, becoming a meshed architecture of security cooperation. Certainly, Japan has always been a provider of technology, so I think they have some interesting opportunities there to be a major player. But again, the kind of my big takeaway is moving from U.S. centricity in its relationships to building out a broader base, as we've talked about. And I think a couple episodes we talked about the new prime minister's willingness to maybe not be as openly critical of the US as our European allies are, but certainly for Japan, willing to not just blindly support our initiatives. So pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think that really resonates with hedging some of your bets as allies and where you get your resources from, because Japan doesn't have a lot of natural resources
They
and
do
they
not.
have to rely on external partners for a lot of those things. And it'd be interesting to see as they change Article 9 that you mentioned, because they're the Japanese Self Defense Forces, right? The whole name of their military, it's not a military, it's a self defense force.
It's security, right?
Security, right? They are building it up because they do have threats from North Korea and from China that have great ambitions of taking some of those resources or cutting off some of those resources. They're in an interesting position and sounds like they're doing things to make sure their people are supported with or without some US help.
Yeah, fascinating. That was the most interesting piece of the conference for me. I don't focus on Japan as much as I might, but their moves are pretty profound. I do think it's an interesting question is what their people are going to allow.
Yeah, and because we're still within a lifetime of December 7th, 1941, and what the world looked like less than 100 years ago with respect to Japan being our adversaries and then moving into some of our closest allies.
And look at the price they disproportionately paid for their involvement in that conflict. I totally see the choice we're making, but I think it's a little microcosm of the rewiring that we've talked about, and that is the systems aren't collapsing, but they are shifting.
Yep. Well, there's also some shift on economic power and how that impacts national security. They also had some diverse transitions,
Yeah,
reminiscent of this podcast,
exactly.
and programming that is really after my own heart. So you had debt, food aid, and global stability, and 21st century technological revolution. So, Sue, from being in the room, how were those transitions? Were they as well executed as we do here?
Exactly as well as we do it. Exactly as well as we do it. So, the budget piece was interesting in that the two representatives that were kind of the main show of the budget discussion. This is so arrogant. I thought we did a better job of framing what the budget mess is really about, and that is that, yes, it's playing out through the budget, but really is showing that we are losing our ability to govern by our economic choices that have left us with 70% of our budget being spent before we come into the next year and what that means. I thought the most interesting piece of the conversation that they had is while there is lots of agreement behind the scenes of the world of hurt we're in, there are just not many bipartisan solutions that people are coming up with. Huge discussion about the mandatory programs, Social Security and Medicare, and just how politically fraught those are for any party to bring up. Anytime someone says we're going to have to touch Medicare or Social Security, it is not a politically feasible conversations to have. And so they end up just not being able to tackle that on. This was one area where there wasn't much problem solving at all. In the other ones, I felt like there was some discussion about how we might respond. In this one, it is as fraught as we found it to be. I thought the starkness of the comment that they cannot take on politically the mandatory programs
Hmm.
effectively at all. And interesting, 0 discussion of, "Hey, man, $1.5 trillion dollars for defense, especially with the lessons of Ukraine and Iran. Instead of continuing to pour money into defense technology and capability, where's the work gonna come from in order to force our security leadership to think about how we're gonna implement warfare differently because everyone else seems to be able to do so?" I think they recognize the same issue. I did not come away believing that there's much hope right now of Congress being able to come up with a effective way forward, especially given that no one has figured out how to articulate how we continue to provide for the common good, the mandatory programs, in a fiscally responsible way. So that one feels like it's just still the same bogey you and I talked about.
That's not good.
Yeah.
It's just gotta break. We gotta go bankrupt and start over. Is what
Oh,
they're kind everyone sees this train heading to the crash and, "Oh, that's gonna suck."
yeah, I don't think they said it as explicitly as I did. I'm just saying that was the way I felt about the conversation is there was just
Yeah,
absolutely nothing. I mean, there was talk about let's get rid of the debt limit because that's a meaningless thing that takes time away from doing things. Yeah.
I
Oh,
guess, but
I
then it's
guess, right? But
yeah,
but how has that actually changed? The circumstance is if we can't afford the interest payments, how do we do some of the things we need? I do think that
you gotta
the
say.
answer is what you and I have talked about almost is the predicate to this show, Eric, is at some point, someone has to define an outcome, including in mandatory programs, that people can align against and say, yes, that's something that I can agree to, and then show a path to get there. Right? Because to the point about the mandatory programs, what the politicians go out and do is they say, we're going to have to tackle Medicaid. And what that sounds, or Social Security, what that sounds like is you're not going to be able to count on it.
Right.
If you haven't ever talked about anything about what you're for or where you're going or what outcome you can imagine happening, where you think it can be done differently, how you start against it. I can understand if we're counting on our politicians doing this, it isn't going to happen that way. I think this budget issue is real in terms of we can keep printing money. And, a lot of discussion about should we really go and talk about GDP versus debt ratio? And the issue is, are we growing fast enough to continue to be able to pay it? I guess that's right, but it just doesn't address the fundamental issue of we have inefficient systems that are neither delivering nor allowing us to make new decisions. So budget leadership isn't going to come from the politicians, especially politicians as we allow them to be. Back to power of the people to say, stop this.
Yeah.
Let's see what else. Oh, food actually is one of the most, I don't know, I'm going to say maddening discussions because there is food availability, but access is really constrained. And the amount of money it takes to provide food security is vanishingly small compared to the money we spend on other things. And I will say, just from a personal standpoint, the fact that the US has withdrawn from so many of the tools of diplomacy and aid and left this problem getting worse in a time when it's not the availability of food, but rather who can buy and ship it and provide it is just a maddening issue. It is an issue that the McCain Institute has been really on the forefront of, and the World Food Security Programs and the World Kitchen are all huge things, and they're incredibly hopeful, but there's just this moment when I listen to this conversation, I'm like, it would cost nothing in order to solve this issue. But just the way we're structured and just the logistic transportation realities between who are the people who have and who are the people who need makes this a profound issue to me. So one that feels tractable and maddening elusive because of just the moves in the world that are becoming much more narrow and consequently much less willing to take on this gap.
And this is access to food
Yeah.
internationally due
Yeah.
to malign leaders withholding it for power, or just the infrastructure is not there and we could help establish the infrastructure, or what's the biggest
Yeah,
bottleneck?
I think infrastructure, just look at what's going on in Strait of Hormuz is a great example. This fertilizer problem is going to become real, and it's going to become real in the United States. And in the United States, it turns out to be prices, right? But in other regions that don't have the same supply that we do, it just flips around to become an infrastructure issue and a supply chain issue. So to me, it is global will, global investment in making sure the distribution means are available. I can't change climate. I can't change drought.
Sure.
I can't change the arability of the land, but there are ways for this to move globally that just has not been tackled because it's not to anyone's advantage, even though it is a massive element of conflict and overall economic insecurity.
Yeah, and you got to take care of those basic human needs, right? Food,
Yeah.
water, clothing, before you can advance up to create higher levels. But what about the 21st century technological revolution? Do you have any takeaways from that?
When you squint at it, you hear that every technology is available for everyone. Everyone has more technological capability. Yes, supply chain issues are profoundly problematic. And if you put on top of them constraints being imposed by nation states who want to either execute power or resolve their own scarcity, there are some issues with availability of fundamental resources. But to me, the big takeaway is, and this is particularly from the US's perspective, I'm sure it's everywhere, but the US is we keep building capacity, technological capacity, and we are not turning that capacity into use. Just let's take the microcosm of trying to bring manufacturing and less supply chain dependency to the United States. We view this as a jobs program, but we know that manufacturing is being taken over by AI. So it's not going to necessarily provide more jobs. So where is that translation between the remarkable technological capacity that not only we have, the world has? Yes, it's being constrained by supply chain, but more interestingly, the benefits of it is being more constrained by people who are thinking about how to use it. And so a fair amount of discussion around that issue about how we ensure that we have all the capability, but my view is far too little conversation about how we turn that capacity into outcome.
One of your 2026 predictions was that we were going to stop saying human in the loop. How many times did human in the loop come up?
Almost none.
Oh, well, there you go.
Almost none. But I will also say that it was not an AI-centric set of conversations.
Yeah.
Not because that wasn't the substantive focus. It is the first conference on any topic where AI was discussed so little. I guess I heard it because I think the nature of how we do everything is gonna change, right? The nature of how we do everything is gonna change, and that will affect what we are able to do, how successful we'll be able to do, including what is the human component of that? What is the educational component of that? What is the intellectual capital component of that? What this conference brought home to me was our issues are not that we don't have enough things to stack on top of one another that are more and more impressive. The issue is we can't put our things to as good use as we want, and we can't move the things that we have to the places that we have real need. So this was, to me, a really profound conference in terms of showing that we can't buy our way out of the situations we have, but rather we're gonna have to imagine and effect our way out of the problems that we have. In other words, more isn't gonna do it for us. We have more. We have more food. Modern farming produces more food. We have more technology. Oh my gosh, this great engine we have in America, but globally to produce new technological capability. It's not that we don't have enough things, it's that we can't get those things to provide enough beneficial outcome. And I think maybe I'm making up this new thought. I'd love your thoughts on it. Maybe that's why conflicts of any ilk, we talked about 3 kinds of conflicts here, are having to be managed more than resolved because there's such parity amongst the capabilities, but no shared mechanisms for coming to better outcome. What do you think?
Yeah. I think if you get back to the root, if you define human interest as self interest and the other guy has something that I want, that parity inherently helps bridge that gap or shrink that gap between the two. I think that lends credibility to your theory.
Yeah, I think parity, right. So great point. You would think parity would be security, right? Could be. But if the disparity can't be acquired, but has to be built. The resolution, maybe that's a harder world. I don't know. Anyway, it was a super interesting conference, bipartisan and not particularly contentious. I think everyone's come down to these are real issues. So that's good, right? Good first
Yeah.
step. Like we're in our first step of the 12th step problem, recognize that we have a problem and increasingly recognize what that problem is. We do have to get to work, though. And I don't think it is going to be by simplistic means that we do our work, as evidenced by all these crises that we're now having to manage without being able to resolve.
And that's what you want folks to walk away from this episode remembering or not misunderstanding?
Yeah, I think that's right. Is no more longing for a simpler time when there was an easy fix to the things that we want. I think you said it in the middle of this episode. We've spent so much time trying to resolve the scarcities that we feel by either acquiring what someone else had, global conflict, or by demanding something more of ourselves. And I just think this is one of those moments where we're going to have to just bear down and collectively say, this is not only who we are, but how we need to become that in an environment that is vastly different from the last time we imagined that. And I think what you and I promised we'd do is next week we're going to come back and we're going to start ticking off things that we think will help people think through the problems we have, come to some conclusions about what it is we need to be doing, and then how they get their will into the national dialogue. Is that what we think we're going to do next week?
I think so. And I think we've identified, at least, and we've seen that we can't just throw money at this problem anymore. And we can't throw capability at this problem anymore because, for one, it's fiscally prohibitive. And that's the issue we talked about earlier.
Right.
But also, it's not going to fix it, right? Because you're not putting it to the right uses and you're not putting it into the right locations. So that's what we're going to try to path out.
I almost want to feel bad that we've done more problem identifying, but I actually think that for me, Sedona, and we've been walking up to it, is really a moment of clarity of exactly the things that need to be addressed differently in order to get where our disquiet suggests we need to be.
Sure.
Yep, I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful there, Eric, seriously. But this is just big. And to your point about you can't just throw money at it, look how much bigger government is now and how much more dissatisfied our people are.
Yep.
Look how much military power we have and how Iran is still unsettled, right? Look at us walking away from certain issues has not kept them food security from being existent. There's just a moment where we've got to set our sights on the things we need to do and develop a path to get there, not just keep trying the same things. I'm hopeful. And we'll see if we can't help next week.
Yeah, thanks for sharing some of those insights with us. That's pretty cool discussions y'all had.
It was. I'm always honored to be there and always surprised and grateful to him.
Yeah.
And just so you know, Senator McCain is just kind of a fun guy for me to reflect on. I think everyone who encountered Senator McCain had a complex relationship with him because he wasn't easy. No, he wasn't easy.
Yeah.
Right? And certainly imperfect. But there was a element of not good enough to just get through a moment, but you actually had to get through a moment well. And I think his legacy lives on, and that's what I took away from this conference, is we can do a lot of things, but if we're not getting where we want, it's not good enough.
Yeah. Well, what else are you watching this week?
I think what I'm really watching is putting together next week's podcast, because the idea of us coming up with 3 to 5 identifiable actions that every citizen can take in order to make some of these issues better is going to be a heavy lift. And so that's what I'm watching, is how focused can Sue be on getting her act together so that you and I are ready to have this conversation with our listeners. How about you?
No, I feel like that's something someone could spend their whole life on, writing their PhD thesis, but we'll figure it out for next week's podcast.
We will. Or we'll talk about something else entirely because we couldn't get
Pivot.
it. Yeah.
Yep. Now I'm watching Project Freedom in the Strait of Hormuz. Right? President Trump announced that starting this morning, Monday morning, the U.S. military would help free ships that have been locked up and unable to transit the trade route. Meanwhile, Iran said, don't touch any ships. We're going to free the strait. So ongoing Iranian issues.
Yeah, managed conflict. Fascinating. Fascinating.
Yep. We'll see how it plays out. But that's what we're watching and how we see it. Thank you for joining us. No doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people. So thanks for joining us. We'd love to hear what you think of our direction, focus, and insights. So join us next week. See if Sue and Eric do what we said we're going to do. And please listen to the Understandable Insights podcast wherever you listen. And as always, go forth, do good, and for goodness sakes, be kind to one another because it really does make all the difference.